Russian Belgorod plunged into blackout again after reported substation explosion. Ukraine to start using ballistic missiles regularly after Neptunes, and Ukrainian General Staff confirms strike on explosives factory in Russia and oil terminal in Crimea. We'll talk about this with Mark Voyger, former special advisor to General Ben Hodges, commander of U.S. Army Europe, Senior Fellow, Center for European Policy Analysis. Mark, glad to see you and thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon, Olha. Glad to see you and thank you for inviting me. Always a pleasure.
Mark, Ukraine has successfully used Neptune missiles and plans to regularly use its own ballistic missiles in the future. According to President Volodymyr Zelensky, we have successfully used Neptunes over our cruise missiles more than once. There will come a time when we will be able to start using our own ballistic missiles regularly, the president said. According to him, the development of ballistics is one of the key tasks of state security. Mark, how do you think, what specific operational successes have been achieved with Ukrainians' Neptune cruise missiles to date? How will the regular deployment of Ukrainian-made ballistic missiles shift the strategic balance on the battlefield?
That's a great question. And first of all, let me share my view that the successful use of the Neptune missiles and all other Ukraine-made missiles is a clear demonstration that Ukraine is about to achieve at least operational, if not strategic, self-reliance in the field of long-range strikes, missile strikes, as well as drone strikes. It is part of what I have called for the last 1.5 to 2 years the Trump-proof plan, a plan for victory, a plan for long-range attacks that does not depend on the, let's put it this way, changes of mood of the specific person in the White House, but actually depends on Ukraine's own military-industrial complex, of course, with the support of the European allies, NATO, the European Union, funding, resources, technology, etc. So again, I would like to congratulate both your military, your intelligence, as well as your military-industrial complex for such a major achievement. This is really impressive. A country that has been at war against the largest land power in Eurasia, or at least on the European continent, against the aggressive Russian Federation, a terrorist state. A country such as Ukraine, that is obviously smaller, but is able to actually develop its own unique military capabilities and strike deep inside Russia. The way this is changing the battle space, and of course Russia's calculus, is that for several years, the Russian leadership, the Kremlin, was thinking that the West would not allow Ukraine to use long-range Western weapons to strike deep into Russia. Obviously, now we're talking about the Tomahawks, but still there is no decision on the part of the White House to use those. Of course, we're talking about the German Taurus missiles. Also, as we know, the decision is not there yet. And then, of course, there are the French and the British missiles, but they're not that long range. Obviously, what your military has created, the Neptunes and now the Flamingos, these are really, really successful missiles, and therefore they are making Russia, really, first of all, feel the pain in terms of destroying the Russian oil refining capabilities. As far as I understand, over a third of it has been destroyed, maybe more. I've been reading numbers like 38%, probably more. And I'm sure you will be able to hit even more those plants. This means that the Russian Federation will continue suffering from gasoline shortages, which of course will put a lot of pressure on on Putin's regime, on the population, and maybe there will be some popular discontent that that can put pressure on the regime itself. Also, of course, this is preventing the Russian military from getting enough oil, petroleum products to sustain the war effort. And of course, psychologically, it also shows the Russian leadership, the Russian military, that they're not invulnerable, that Ukraine can hit deep inside this vast Russian territory where no one else has been able to hit, and of course it hurts. So I see several major effects: the purely military one, the economic one, the social one, and definitely the psychological one, and of course the political, strategic one, humiliating Putin, humiliating the Kremlin in such a way, exposing Russia's vulnerabilities to the entire world, because Russia is unable to cover its entire territory with air and missile defense systems, and therefore your military is hitting with precise strikes exactly where it hurts, and it will continue to do so. And this is a great victory in and of itself.
Mark, we truly believe that Russia will continue to face the consequences of the aggression. Ukraine has already, as you said, demonstrated its ability to innovate, adapt, and strike back. And I'm confident that the Russian occupiers will be increasingly surprised by what we are capable of. And on the night of October 6th, the Ukrainian Defense Forces struck the Russian Sverdlov plant in Dzержinsk, Nizhny Novgorod region, as well as the facilities of the marine oil terminal in the temporarily occupied Feodosia in Crimea, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. How critical is the, for example, Sverdlov plant to Russia's overall war effort, particularly in terms of supplying the front lines with the artillery and missile warheads? What strategic role does the sea oil terminal in Feodosia play in supplying fuel or resources to Russian military operations in southern Ukraine or Crimea?
Well, to continue my previous thoughts, what I said earlier, your military, intelligence services are extremely good, extremely adept, and very skillful in identifying targets that can really hurt the Russian military industrial complex, and of course the Russian economy, as we said, the military effect and the economic effect, of course, and the psychological effect. So obviously, destroying the oil processing plants is one part of the equation. An important element of this strategic game of knocking the Russian economy out, so it is not able to sustain the war effort. The other important element, of course, is hitting those oil terminals, as you pointed out, and so. Russia is using those terminals, of course, to get oil out on the world market, or to sell oil-derived products. And so, I can imagine that if these ports, if these facilities are under constant threat of Ukrainian missiles, Ukrainian strikes, maybe long-range drones too. Then this will create even more economic pressures on Russia and on the Kremlin regime. Also regarding the plant that you referred to, of course, now there's a great game. There's a great competition between Russia, Ukraine, and between Russia on the one hand, and then Ukraine and Europe and the West as a whole on the other. In that, the question is who is going to be able to manufacture more ammunition, more critical components, especially for for drones, for missile manufacturing, etc. As we know, Russia has been preparing for this war for a long time, and Russia is being aided by China, by North Korea, by Iran. Europe and the US, unfortunately, have been lagging behind somewhat in terms of especially manufacturing artillery shells and more, let's put it this way, simpler but more numerous components and ammunition. So knocking out one Russian plant like this is, I think, a huge victory again, because it will reduce Russia's capability to sustain, as I said, the war effort, and not only on the battlefield, but also to hit civilian targets. You know better than I do that while Ukraine is always targeting either military targets or targets of strategic economic value, as we spoke, the Russian regime, because it's a terrorist, aggressive regime, it always predominantly hits civilian targets in Ukraine. And so when you destroy such a plant, obviously it will give some relief, I hope, and some pause in the Russian attacks against the Ukrainian cities and civilian population.
Mark, Belgorod in Russia is facing another blackout with power out in several districts. Some reports also point to severe disruptions in water supply and internet access. According to Belgorod Governor Vyacheslav Gladkov, Russian channels claim a missile strike allegedly hit the city's Olha substation. The substation is on fire and most of the city is experiencing widespread electricity outages. Numerous photos and videos have surfaced online showing the explosion at the substation and the resulting power loss. We understand, but what is the strategic importance of the Olha substation in Belgorod's energy grid, and how long, in your opinion, is the estimated recovery time from the damage sustained? And what are the wider implications of repeated infrastructure strikes on Belgorod? Is Russia moving to harden such targets or improve air defense in the region? Here, more about air defense, not in this region, but in Russia in general.
Well, obviously, in this conversation, we're covering all elements of the military and economic warfare between, Russia and Ukraine. Russia has been striking also at your electrical grid and your power stations, your, water processing plants and other facilities, and quite logically, your military is also targeting the Russian facilities of this nature. So we spoke about the destruction of the targeting of the oil refineries, and then the oil terminals, and then the various military manufacturing plants. Of course, now it's the turn. The turn has come for the Russian electrical grid to be targeted, just like Russia has been doing for the fourth consecutive year, and is still trying to do it. Obviously, the Russian strategy this winter will be to target more of your electrical grid, power plants, so that there are blackouts in Ukraine. Obviously, you have to pay them back. Let's put it this way, and make the population at least feel the same pain. So they hopefully start putting pressure on the regime. Of course, it's a huge embarrassment and humiliation for the Kremlin, as I said. Obviously, Belgorod is relatively near the Ukrainian border, so it will be very difficult, in my opinion, for the Russians to protect such vital facilities, even if they bring additional air defense and other assets. Being so close to the border really allows you to surprise them. And so I don't know really how quickly they will be able to restore that particular element of the grid. But I can imagine that your military will keep hitting if it creates such blackouts. it's difficult to see how they can be hardened successfully, especially if you also use some of your very successful missiles against them. So ultimately, Russia has started a war hoping that they will be invulnerable, that they can hide behind their long distances, obviously thousands of kilometers deep into Eurasia, into Siberia. But now this is playing against them because they cannot cover their huge territory all at once, all the strategic assets and facilities. They cannot protect them simultaneously. And your military has not even targeted seriously the Russian cities, especially the big cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg, the way the Russians are doing. And so I can imagine that if the Russians are protecting those two major cities, then they have to take air defense systems away from other facilities, from, as we spoke, from the electrical grid, from power plants, oil terminals, etc. And obviously, your military and intelligence are very successful in exploiting those gaps.
Mark, we saw that Chinese reconnaissance satellites flew over Ukrainians fast during Russia's overnight attack, and the flyovers of Chinese reconnaissance satellites over Lviv during the attack are actions by China aimed at supporting the war being waged by Russia. This opinion was expressed on Espresso TV by Igor Romanenko, founder of the charitable foundation We Will Close the Sky of Ukraine and former deputy chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. And he noted that the Russians refer to the fact that the Americans will continue to provide Ukraine with intelligence, which is important for carrying out strikes deep inside Russian territory. That's why they are turning to their allies, China, for information. What are China's long-term strategic goals in maintaining or expanding its intelligence cooperation with Russia in the context of Ukraine? Is Beijing testing Western red lines by engaging in low visibility support to Moscow without crossing into overt military aid?
That's a great question. Let's go back briefly to 2022 and the weeks and months before Russia launched its aggression against your country. As you know, Putin went to visit the President Xi in Beijing for the opening of the Olympics in 2022, and in most likelihood he was also there to report to his Chinese counterpart that the invasion of Ukraine is coming soon. Obviously, right after the Olympic Games were over, which is what happened. I think that back in the day, during that meeting, most likely Putin also told President Xi that there's nothing to worry about, that the Ukrainian forces will surrender, the Ukrainian government will collapse, and then Russia will be able to take Kiev in 3 days, and then Ukraine in 1 week, 10 days. All these fantastic, ridiculous, unrealistic expectations that the Russian leadership had at the time. And so initially, China most likely gave its blessing for this war, hoping that Russia would overwhelm the Ukrainian defenses and be able to seize control of Ukraine very, very quickly. I would imagine that if this had happened, that China maybe would have also launched its own aggressive strike against Taiwan. But since your country resisted and is still fighting and winning in many ways, and is not giving up, the Chinese strategy has changed, and now they're seeing that Russia needs all the help it can get. Obviously, the Russian economy is getting weaker. And so without Chinese support, Russia cannot sustain this war effort. I'm talking about financial support, political support, military, of course, in terms of military supplies, electronics, obviously technological support. And also, in this case, as you pointed out, intelligence. I read the the report that you spoke about, that 3 Chinese satellites flew over Lviv and that area, and most likely provided intelligence to the Russians. This is quite possible. The Chinese long-term strategy now is to help Russia sustain its war effort, its aggression against Ukraine for as long as possible, because this, in the Chinese perception, distracts the West and drives Western assets away from the Pacific area. In other words, as the West is forced, the US and Europe, to actually dedicate money, resources, missiles, missile defense, ammunition, all sorts of military systems to help Ukraine. Obviously, these assets, that weapons, etc., that will not be sent to the Far East, to East Asia, in case China decides to attack Taiwan. Obviously, the Chinese leadership is aggressive. President Xi is a Maoist, and he believes in the unification of China by force, if necessary. And so the island of Taiwan is of strategic importance for Beijing, for the current Chinese leadership. Therefore, anything that would make the West distracted in the Western, in the European theater, in Western Eurasia, in Europe, in Ukraine, is actually welcome for the Chinese leadership, because they can prepare better for the attack against Taiwan, which may come, if not next year, maybe 2027 in a couple. Yeah, and so this is the great grand strategic picture, the great game, the great Eurasian strategic game that the Beijing and President Xi are playing against Ukraine and against the West as a whole.
Mark, during a massive combined strike on Ukraine on the night of the 5th of October, Russia used 549 weapons containing 102,785 components manufactured abroad by companies from the United States, China, and Taiwan, Great Britain, Germany, Switzerland, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and the Netherlands. How is it possible that after nearly 4 years of full-scale war, full-scale invasion, Russia is still able to access tens of thousands of foreign-made components for its missile and drone programs? What specific loopholes or blind spots in the international sanctions regime are being exploited to deliver dual-use technologies to Russia?
Yeah, this is a very difficult question. It's actually a shame. Absolutely, it's a crime. Really, it's a moral. It shows the moral failure of companies that sell such components to Russia or its allies. Unfortunately, this has been a long-standing tradition, not only in Russia but in the Soviet Union. Even before. Before it collapsed during the Cold War, 40 or 50 years in the past, they had an intelligence apparatus that was that had a specific goal, the specific goal of buying, procuring, finding Western, especially American, electronics and military equipment, dual-use electronics, of course. That the Soviet Union was not able to manufacture. And so back in the day, they would do it through front companies, through third countries, such as in the Middle East, the Arab countries, and some countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. I can imagine that this is happening these days. Russia is quite popular, unfortunately, because of its information warfare. All across the so-called global South, so Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, Asia, South Asia, and so we can see companies that operate through some small nations. Once I read something about the Maldives exporting huge amounts of electronics. Obviously, this is in violation of the sanctions regime. Obviously, Russia has this huge border with Iran, with Central Asia, with China. So it's impossible to seal. These are tens of thousands of kilometers, of course. And so, of course, the West and Europe and the US are trying to impose sanctions, and they keep adding more and more companies to the sanctions list. But unfortunately, the Russians and the Chinese are finding more and obviously additional ways, additional opportunities, additional avenues to supply those components. Again, front companies, third countries that are formally not under sanctions. And so it's an ongoing struggle. There's nothing, I wish I could say that somehow this can be solved immediately. Unfortunately, there's no single bullet, there's no silver bullet, there's no single solution to this problem. It's just, the West has to keep adding more companies, putting more pressure on those governments, on those banks, because it's an ongoing struggle. It will likely not end very soon. I have to be brutally honest that Russia and China are finding all sorts of all possible ways to evade those sanctions, and so the West must keep the pressure. There's no other way.
Mark, thank you very much for the insightful conversation. Your expertise and strategic perspective are always invaluable, especially at such critical time for Ukraine and the wider region. Looking forward to our next discussion. Today we were joined by Mark Voyger, former special advisor to General Ben Hodges, commander of US Army Europe and senior fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Mark, I wish you all the best and see you.
Thank you, Olha, and Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!